Do you feel a secret loneliness creeping in because of the spiritual gifts God has given you? You're not alone. Many believers experience this hidden struggle. And shocking reasons explain why your prophetic insights, healing touch, or discerning spirit might set you apart, pulling you into isolation even as they draw you closer to Him. You're misunderstood by others, your visions or words of knowledge leaving them confused. As 1 Corinthians 14:2 urges you to pursue love with your gifts. You're overwhelmed by intensity, the weight of God's presence or visions isolating you, because Acts 2:17 says He pours His Spirit on you. You're feared by some, your authority or miracles making people uneasy, though Matthew 10:22 warns you'll be hated for His name. You're burdened by responsibility, feeling the call to serve without support. As 1 Peter 4:10 says, steward your gifts. You're secretly envied others, resenting your anointing, because James 3:16 says envy brings disorder. You're drained by discernment, seeing what others miss. As Hebrews 5:14 says, the mature discern good and evil. You're set apart by timing, your gifts activating when others aren't ready. Though Ecclesiastes 3:1 says there's a season for everything. You're isolated by rejection, churches, or friends avoiding your boldness. But John 15:18 says the world hated Jesus first. You're weary from criticism, judged for stepping out in faith. As Galatians 4:16 asks if truth makes you an enemy. You're burdened by silence, unsure who to share your gifts with, because Proverbs 29:11 says a wise man holds his tongue. You're lonely in obedience, following God's call against the crowd. As Matthew 7:14 says, the narrow path is for few. You're overwhelmed by spiritual warfare, gifts attracting attacks. Though Ephesians 6:12 says your battle is not fleshly, you're set apart by purity, your gifts requiring holiness others avoid. As 2 Timothy 2:21 says vessels for honor are sanctified. You're secretly grieving, longing for connection amidst your calling. But Psalm 34:18 says God is near the brokenhearted. You're tired of misinterpretation, your gifts twisted by skeptics. As 1 Thessalonians 5:20 warns not to despise prophecies. You're isolated by depth, your spiritual insights outpacing peers. Because 1 Corinthians 2:14 says the natural man doesn't grasp spiritual things. You're burdened by intercession, carrying others' pain. As Romans 8:26 says the Spirit intercedes. You're feared for power, your gifts unsettling the comfortable. Though Acts 4:13 notes, boldness amazes onlookers. You're lonely in maturity, outgrowing shallow faith. As Hebrews 5:12 says, some need milk, not solid food. You're overwhelmed by expectation, others demanding miracles. But Matthew 7:22-23 warns against presumption. You're set apart by surrender, your gifts costing comfort. As Luke 9:23 says, deny yourself daily. You're secretly wrestling with pride, your gifts tempting ego, because 1 Corinthians 13:22 says love must accompany them. You're tired of being a target, spiritual gifts drawing envy or attack. As Psalm 23:5 says, God prepares a table before enemies. You're isolated by uniqueness, your gift rare among believers. Though Romans 12:6 says gifts differ by grace. You're burdened by timing, your gifts maturing slowly. As Habakkuk 2:3 says the vision waits. You're lonely in conviction, standing firm when others waver, because Joshua 1-9 calls you to be strong. You're overwhelmed by mystery, your gifts unfolding gradually. As 1 Corinthians 13:12 says, you see dimly now. You're set apart by calling, your gifts aligning with God's plan. Though Jeremiah 1-5 says He knew you before birth. You're secretly longing for community, craving those who understand. But Acts 2:42 says fellowship strengthens. You're tired of being misjudged, your gifts seen as strange. As 1 Samuel 16:7 says, God looks at the heart. You're isolated by sacrifice, your gifts demanding your all, as Romans 12:1 urges a living sacrifice. You're burdened by intercession's weight, praying alone, though Colossians 4:2 says persevere in it. You're set apart by anointing, your gifts marking you, as Isaiah 61:1 says the Spirit anoints you. You're lonely in obedience to the Spirit, following where others won't, because John 16:13 guides you into truth. You're overwhelmed by divine interruptions, gifts disrupting life, as Acts 9:6 says, arise and go. You're secretly seeking validation, wanting affirmation, but 2 Corinthians 10:18 says, approval comes from God. You're tired of being a lightning rod, gifts attracting conflict, though Romans 8:28 says all works for good. You're isolated by the weight of revelation, your gifts revealing truths others can't handle. As Daniel 12:4 says, knowledge increases. You're burdened by the call to teach, your insights intimidating, though 2 Timothy 2:2 says entrust to faithful men. You're set apart by humility, your gifts requiring meekness, as Philippians 2:3 says value others above yourself. You're secretly wrestling with doubt, wondering if your gifts are real. But 1 Corinthians 12:11 says the Spirit distributes them. You're tired of being overlooked, your gifts undervalued. As 1 Corinthians 12:22 says, weaker parts are indispensable. You're isolated by the cost of obedience, your gifts demanding sacrifice, though Mark 8:34 says take up your cross. You're burdened by the silence of others, few joining your prayer. As Matthew 18:20 says, where to gather, he's there. You're set apart by divine timing, your gifts unfolding uniquely. As Galatians 4:4 says, God sent Jesus in the fullness of time. You're secretly yearning for mentorship, lacking guidance. But Proverbs 15:22 says plans fail without counsel. You're tired of being a pioneer, your gifts breaking new ground. As Isaiah 43:19 says, God makes a way. You're isolated by the weight of prophecy, your words unheeded, though Amos 3:7 says God reveals to his servants. You're burdened by the call to heal, carrying others' pain, as James 5:16 says prayer of the righteous heals. You're set apart by the Spirit's fire, your gifts burning within, as Acts 1:8 says, you'll receive power. You're secretly longing for rest, gifts exhausting you, but Matthew 11:28 says Jesus gives rest. You're tired of being a scapegoat, gifts blamed for issues, as 1 Peter 2:19 says suffering for doing good is grace. You're isolated by the call to purity, your gifts demanding holiness, though 1 Thessalonians 4:7 says God calls you to sanctification. You're burdened by the weight of wisdom, your insights heavy, as James 1:5 says God gives generously. You're set apart by divine purpose, your gifts fulfilling his will. As Ephesians 2:10 says, you're created for good works. You're secretly wrestling with fear, gifts exposing you, but to Timothy 1:7 says God gives power. You're tired of being a bridge, connecting heaven and earth, as Genesis 28:12 says, angels ascend and descend. You're isolated by the call to serve, your gifts requiring giving, though Galatians 5:13 says serve in love. You're burdened by the weight of tongues, your prayer private. As 1 Corinthians 14:2 says, you speak mysteries. You're set apart by the call to lead, your gifts guiding, as Hebrews 13:17 says obey your leaders. You're secretly longing for understanding, gifts confusing you, but Proverbs 3:5 says trust God. You're tired of being a watchman, your gifts eluding, as Ezekiel 33:6 says warn the people. You're isolated by the call to endure, your gifts tested, though James 1:12 says the steadfast receive the crown. You're burdened by the weight of miracles, your hands heavy, as John 14:12 says greater works follow. You're set apart by divine favor, your gifts blessed, as Psalm 5:12 says God surrounds the righteous. You're secretly yearning for unity, gifts dividing, but Ephesians 4:3 says maintain the bond of peace. You're tired of being a vessel, your gifts poured out, as 2 Corinthians 4:7 says treasure in jars of clay. You're isolated by the call to stand, your gifts firm, as Ephesians 6:13 says withstand in evil days. You're burdened by the weight of faith, your gifts stretching you. As Hebrews 11:6 says, without faith it's impossible. You're set apart by the Spirit's leading, your gifts directed, as Romans 8:14 says, the Spirit leads sons. You're secretly longing for joy, gifts bringing trials. But Nehemiah 8:10 says joy is your strength. You're tired of being a light, your gifts exposing darkness, as Matthew 5:14 says you're the light of the world. You're isolated by the call to sacrifice, your gifts costly, though Philippians 3:8 says gain Christ above all. You're burdened by the weight of love, your gifts demanding it, as 1 Corinthians 13:13 says love endures. You're set apart by divine appointment, your gifts chosen, as John 15:16 says, you're appointed to bear fruit. You're secretly yearning for peace, gifts stirring conflict, but John 16:33 says Jesus gives peace. You're tired of being a conduit, your gifts flowing through, as Zechariah 4:6 says it's by His Spirit. You're isolated by the call to persevere, your gifts tested, though 2 Thessalonians 3:13 says don't grow weary. You're burdened by the weight of glory, your gifts reflecting Him. As 2 Corinthians 3:18 says, you're transformed. You're set apart by eternal purpose, your gifts eternal, as 1 Corinthians 13:8 says love never ends. You're secretly longing for home, gifts pointing heavenward, but Revelation 21:4 says God wipes every tear. You're tired of being a warrior, your gifts in battle, as Ephesians 6:10 says be strong in the Lord. You're isolated by the call to shine, your gifts noticed, though Matthew 5:16 says let your light shine. You're burdened by the weight of hope, your gifts inspiring, as Romans 15:13 says God fills you with hope. You're set apart by divine love, your gifts from Him, as 1 John 4:19 says we love because He first loved us. You feel isolated, but it's part of your journey. Embrace your gifts. Trust God's plan and seek those who share your calling. Because 1 Corinthians 12:27 says you're part of His body and your strength lies in His purpose to stand tall.